Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute crystalline precision.
Right, like it's engineering or something.
Exactly. You fall off a bike, you break your arm, the x-ray goes up on the light board, and it shows that unmistakable jagged white line. The doctor just points a pen at it and says, there it is.
It's binary. I mean, the bone is either intact or it's fractured. And as humans, we crave that. We really like things to be visible, categorized, and neatly solved.
We really do. But then you step out of the orthopedist's office and into the world of human attraction, neurodevelopment, and, well, evolutionary psychology. And suddenly, that beautiful, precise x-ray machine is just completely shattered.
Oh, completely. It's a mess.
Yeah, we are looking at a behavioral landscape that is murky, chaotic, and driven by ancient biological forces we barely even notice in our day-to-day lives. And understanding that invisible architecture is exactly what we are doing today.
And it is a fascinating architecture to look at.
It really is. So we're taking a comprehensive, ultra-long, and highly incisive journey into a new 2026 ebook. It's titled Hormones and Hypocrisy, The Ovulation Deception and Female Attraction Cues by Conrad Reicher.
And we really need to establish the context of this text immediately.
Yeah.
I mean, Riker does not write for a general mass market audience.
No, definitely not.
In his preface, he is exceptionally explicit about who this book is for. It is a manual written specifically for a men's rights activist audience, and specifically for what he terms red-pilled manosphere men.
Right.
He actually actively tells readers who are looking for comfortable, ego-soothing narratives to just put the book down and walk away.
Which brings us to our impartiality clause for the show. If you're joining us for the first time, our mission is always to impartially report on the source material. We aren't endorsing these viewpoints.
Right, we aren't taking a stance.
Exactly. We aren't preaching ethics, and we certainly aren't taking sides in the culture war. Our goal is to dissect the arguments, explain the underlying mechanisms the author presents, and convey these ideas exactly as they're written.
We want you to understand the specific structural architecture of this worldview, no matter how provocative or uncomfortable it might get.
And it is a vast, deeply controversial architecture.
Oh, absolutely. Riker is attempting to explain the entire history of Western institutions, the biological foundations of human mating, and how those institutions functioned before. In his words, they were captured by feminists and Marxists.
It's a huge claim.
It is. It weaves together evolutionary biology, legal history, epistemology, and modern dating dynamics into one massive unified theory.
It is a dense, unapologetic text.
Yeah.
And because it is so meticulously constructed, if you find yourself hooked by this analysis and you want to dive into the raw, unfiltered source material yourself, which you probably will want to do after we get through this, you should check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book.
Highly recommend reading the raw text, yeah.
Yeah, and also make sure to follow the author at Conrad and Riker on his Substack for his ongoing essays. And on a quick housekeeping note, if you appreciate us taking these deep dives into complex, challenging material, please take a second right now to like this video or audio and subscribe to the show.
It really helps us out.
It's the absolute best way to help us keep bringing you this level of analysis. Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the biological foundation.
Good place to start.
Yeah.
So Riker anchors his entire thesis on a concept he calls the ovulation deception. He doesn't begin with philosophy. He begins with raw, modern data. Specifically, a massive 2019 internal Tinder data leak.
And the numbers from that leak are genuinely jarring. I mean, Riker points to data showing that the top 10% of men on the dating app received 78% of female right swipes during those women's ovulation windows.
It's a staggering concentration.
Right. Nearly 80% of the romantic and sexual interest was funneled to just 1/10 of the male population.
What's fascinating here is that Riker goes a step further to define who that top 10% actually is. He argues this isn't about men with, nice bios or good conversational skills.
Definitely not.
He notes this tier is populated almost entirely by men displaying specific hypermasculine phenotypic markers. We are talking about visual indicators of high testosterone-heavy brow ridges, dense jawlines, high shoulder-to-waist ratios, facial symmetry.
He describes this as a sudden, ruthless biological caste system.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, he argues that when the biological imperative to reproduce hits its monthly peak, The modern, polite mask of romantic egalitarianism just completely slips off. The idea that everybody's beautiful in their own way just vanishes, and millions of years of evolutionary filtering take over.
Exactly.
But why does this happen specifically during ovulation, and why is it so hidden from our conscious society?
Well, this is where Riker leans heavily into the evolutionary concept of concealed ovulation. If you look at the vast majority of mammals, around 98% of them, according to the research, Riker cites females very openly broadcast their fertility.
Like primates, right?
Yeah, think of primates. They have physical swellings, they emit incredibly potent pheromones, they have obvious behavioral shifts. They loudly signal to the entire male population that they are in estrus and ready to mate.
Mm.
But human females evolved an entirely different strategy. They evolved to hide their fertility window.
So a human male has absolutely no obvious, glaring visual cue that his partner is ovulating.
None at all.
And Riker claims this wasn't some random evolutionary mutation or an accident. He cites a 2019 Swedish cohort study by evolutionary biologist Professor Gunnar Carlson. Carlson argues that concealed ovulation is actually an incredibly sophisticated biological strategy for resource extraction.
Let's look at the mechanism behind that strategy. Because in a prehistoric environment, if a male knows exactly when a female is fertile, say for just 3 days a month, he only needs to guard her, provide food, and offer protection for those 3 days to ensure his genetic legacy.
Makes sense.
Right, and once she is no longer fertile, he can leave and expend his energy elsewhere.
But by hiding the fertile window, the female essentially traps the male in a state of continuous, unending resource provision.
Yes, exactly.
If he never knows when she can conceive, he has to stick around permanently. He has to guard her every day, hunt for her every day, and build shelter for her every day. The concealment is the mechanism that binds the male to the pair bond.
And this creates a fascinating, almost schizophrenic duality in human-female mating strategies, which Riker labels the good genes versus good dad biological shift.
Oh, this part is wild.
It is, because the woman needs both top-tier DNA to create a robust infant and a reliable, dedicated provider to ensure that infant survives a harsh environment. But historically, those two traits rarely existed in the same man.
Right, the guy out wrestling saber-toothed tigers with high testosterone and a perfect jawline isn't necessarily the guy who wants to sit in the cave for 10 years raising a toddler.
Exactly. So Riker breaks this down into two distinct hormonal phases. During the fertile window, the few days around day 14 of the cycle when conception risk peaks, women's subconscious preferences shift radically toward good genes.
They actively seek out alpha traits.
They do. They're drawn to dominant, aggressive, highly masculine men because their immune systems and physical prowess are exactly what the biology wants to pass on.
But then we hit the luteal phase, the second half of the cycle when fertility plummets and conception is virtually impossible. Riker argues this is when the biological safety mode engages.
Right.
Suddenly the preference shifts. The woman's biology stops looking for the aggressive warrior and starts looking for the good dad. She seeks out beta traits, agreeable, nurturing, reliable, safe providers who will stick around and share resources.
To prove how deeply ingrained this shift is, Riker brings in a famous 2008 UCLA study on voice modulation. The researchers recorded women speaking throughout the month.
I remember reading about this.
Yeah, they found that women's voices actually rise in pitch during their ovulation window. They don't do it consciously. The larynx tightens slightly under the influence of estrogen, raising the frequency of the voice.
And from an evolutionary standpoint, that higher frequency subconsciously signals youth, health, and peak fertility. It acts as an acoustic trigger for male arousal circuits. Riker highlights the absolute paradox here. He argues women are biologically programmed to intentionally amplify their sexual signals to attract the most aggressive, dominant males in their vicinity during this exact, incredibly narrow window of time.
He pairs this biological signaling with a concept he coins the lady slipper hypothesis. It is a highly mechanistic, almost cynical view of modern human interaction. He names it after a specific orchid, the Cypripedium calceolus.
The lady slipper orchid. Honestly, this part of the book blew my mind.
It's a great analogy.
The orchid evolved to perfectly mimic the pheromones of a specific female bee. A male bee catches the scent, flies over, and tries to copulate with the flower. In the process, he covers himself in pollen.
But he gets nothing.
Exactly. The flower offers absolutely zero nectar in return. The bee expends his energy, gets nothing, and flies off to pollinate the next flower. The flower successfully extracts the labor it needs without ever fulfilling the bee's biological goal.
Riker argues that a massive portion of modern female signaling operates on this exact same lady slipper logic. He points to cosmetics, push-up bras, flirtatious text messaging, even modern Instagram posturing.
It's all biological mimicry.
Right. They artificially simulate reproductive availability to extract resources, whether that's free drinks, dinner dates, career favors, or just pure dopamine validation from men, without ever actually offering the genetic exchange the man's biology is seeking.
So in this model, the man is the bee operating on ancient reproductive software, and the woman is the orchid, capitalizing on that software to extract utility. But if you're listening to this, you might be thinking, wait a minute, we aren't bees. We have frontal lobes, we have literature and philosophy and the capacity for rational thought. If biology is this deterministic, if we are all just walking hormone receptors executing ancient code, how does Riker account for free will?
That is the philosophical crux of his entire first section.
Right, like does he think conscious choice just doesn't exist when we are out on a date?
Essentially, yes. Riker fundamentally believes that conscious, rational choice in the realm of attraction is largely a post hoc rationalization.
Meaning we make the decision biologically and then invent a story to justify it later?
Precisely. The ancient biological hardware, the amygdala, the endocrine system, is running the show in milliseconds. Our modern conscious minds, the prefrontal cortex, are just acting as the PR department.
The PR department, I love that.
Right. We invent romantic narratives about shared interests or a great sense of humor to justify decisions that were already mathematically calculated by our hormones based on jaw density and waist-to-hip ratios. And this biological determinism is exactly what leads to what Riker calls the great hypocrisy in modern dating.
Which perfectly transitions us into the impact of modern pharmacology. Because if nature spent millions of years designing this intricate, hidden system of concealed ovulation and hormonal shifting, what happens when human beings suddenly throw synthetic hormones into the mix?
That changes everything.
Let's talk about the birth control pill. Riker brings up Klaus Widekind's highly influential 1995 sweaty t-shirt study from the University of Bern.
This study is a cornerstone in evolutionary psychology. Wedekind wanted to see if human beings, like other animals, use scent to determine genetic compatibility. He had a group of men wear cotton t-shirts for 3 consecutive days.
Gross, but necessary.
Yeah, no deodorant, no scented soaps, no spicy foods, just raw, natural human scent. He put these shirts in boxes and had women smell them and rate their attractiveness.
Now, you'd think sweaty shirts would just be universally repulsive, but they weren't. The results showed a distinct mathematical pattern. Women consistently preferred the scent of men whose immune systems, specifically their major histocompatibility complex, or MHC, were the most dissimilar to their own.
We really need to explain the mechanism here because it is fascinating. The MHC is a set of genes that codes for proteins found on the surfaces of cells that help the immune system recognize foreign substances.
Okay.
When a woman smells a man's sweat, her olfactory receptors are actually detecting the peptide byproducts of his specific MHC genes.
It's basically a biological barcode reader.
Exactly.
And the reason opposites attract on an immune system level is purely for the survival of the offspring. If you mate with someone who has a completely different immune system profile than yours, your child inherits a broader, more robust combined defense system.
They can fight off a wider variety of pathogens.
Right. It is a brilliant biological failsafe against inbreeding and disease.
It is a masterpiece of evolution. But here is Riker's explosive claim regarding modern society. He argues that hormonal birth control completely deactivates this primordial sensory apparatus.
Wow.
By introducing synthetic estrogen and progestin, the pill tricks the female body into thinking it is already pregnant. Riker calls this a permanent phantom pregnancy.
So the body is locked into a chemically induced permanent luteal phase.
Yes. And remember the good genes versus good dad shift.
Right.
Because the body believes it is already pregnant, the biological priority completely abandons the search for good genes. It no longer needs the aggressive high testosterone alpha with the dissimilar immune system. Women on the pill, according to Riker, lose their ability to smell genetic compatibility entirely. Their olfactory radar goes completely dead.
So what do they look for instead?
Because the body thinks it's pregnant, it desperately wants safety. It seeks out softer, highly agreeable, reliable beta providers who offer physical security and resources. The chemical alteration fundamentally changes the type of man she finds attractive.
And Riker backs this up with some truly intense speculation based on raw data. He pulls from the Notre Dame Women's Hormone Project, looking at data spanning from 2018 to 2023. And the number he zeroes in on is a staggering 62% divorce rate within 3 years of a woman stopping the pill.
And the mechanism he describes behind that statistic is quietly tragic. Let's trace the timeline. A young woman meets a man, falls in love, and marries him. But she does all of this while she is on hormonal birth control.
Okay.
She has unknowingly selected him using her chemically induced luteal phase preferences. She views him as safe, agreeable, a wonderful provider. Then, maybe a few years into the marriage, they decide they want to start a family. She stops taking the pill.
The synthetic hormones clear her system, the phantom pregnancy ends.
And her natural biology violently snaps back to its ovulatory baseline.
Yeah.
Suddenly, for the first time in years, the good gene's sensory apparatus comes back online. She can subconsciously smell his MHC profile again. And, according to Riker, she looks at the very provider she chose while she was chemically altered, and she is biologically, viscerally repulsed by him. He lacks the alpha markers her unsuppressed biology is now screaming for.
To put this in a different context, imagine you are out shopping for a high-performance sports car. You want power, speed, the thrill of the drive, but the dealership forces you to wear a thick blindfold and noise-canceling earplugs while you shop.
Great analogy.
Right, you can't see the car, you can't hear the engine. All you can do is feel the plushness of the seats and check how much trunk space it has. You find one that feels incredibly safe and practical. You sign the papers, buy it, and drive it for 3 years. Then one day the blindfold comes off, you look in your driveway and realize you bought a minivan.
Yeah.
Now, the minivan is perfectly fine, it's reliable, it does the job, it gets you to the grocery store, but it is absolutely fundamentally not what your primal self actually wanted to drive.
That is a perfect, if painful, analogy for what Riker terms the luteal lie. He argues that this pharmacological phenomenon has created a societal epidemic of nice guy syndrome. Millions of men are acting according to the safe, agreeable preferences they see modeled and verbally requested by women.
They become the minivan.
They become the minivan, only to find themselves utterly rejected, dead bedroomed, or divorced the moment the woman's natural, unsuppressed hormonal cycle returns and demands the sports car.
It's a terrifying prospect if you view relationships through this strictly biological lens. And from this foundation of biological hardware and pharmacological manipulation, the book naturally moves to how these mismatched, hidden preferences manifest in society at large.
Right, stepping back to look at the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This brings us to what Riker calls the ruthless economics of the sexual marketplace.
And ruthless is arguably an understatement. Riker sets up this concept by bringing in the research of Dr. Devendra Singh from the University of Texas. Dr. Singh spent years establishing that the 0.7 waist-to-hip ratio, or WHR, is an absolute cross-cultural constant for male attraction.
It doesn't matter if you are looking at the ancient Paleolithic Venus of Willendorf statue carved from limestone or a digitally altered modern Instagram model. The specific ratio remains identical.
Totally identical.
But why 0.7? What is the biological mechanism there?
It's an incredible piece of evolutionary biomechanics. Human beings are bipedal, we walk upright. This requires a relatively narrow pelvis for efficient locomotion. But we also have incredibly large brains, which require a massive birth canal.
Ah, so they conflict.
Right. These two evolutionary needs are in direct conflict. Furthermore, fetal brain development, particularly in the third trimester, requires massive amounts of omega-3 fatty acids, specifically DHA.
And where does the female body store those specific fatty acids?
In glutafemoral fat, the fat deposits around the hips and thighs. Dr. Singh's research showed that a waist-to-hip ratio of exactly 0.7 indicates the optimal balance.
So it's like a visual math equation.
Yes. It means enough glutafemoral fat to supply the DHA for a large-brained infant, combined with an optimal pelvic structure for childbirth, while also signaling high estrogen and low susceptibility to major diseases like diabetes. Riker is just hardwired to instantly calculate that 0.7 ratio as the ultimate proxy for fertility and health.
And Riker aggressively contrasts this hardwired, unchangeable biological reality with the modern body positivity movement. He doesn't view body positivity as a genuine push for social acceptance.
Not at all.
He views it cynically, calling it a cultural lie designed by lower-tier competitors to lower the defensive standards of high-status men. He argues you cannot socially engineer a biological imperative out of the male hindbrain.
But the true, staggering inequality of this marketplace is illuminated by the data he pulls regarding female attraction toward men. He applies an economic concept here, the Gini coefficient.
Right. If you've studied economics, you know the Gini coefficient is used to measure wealth inequality within a nation. A coefficient of zero point 0.0 means perfect equality. Everyone has the exact same amount of money. A coefficient of 1.0 means perfect, absolute inequality. One single person holds 100% of the nation's wealth, and everyone else has zero. Riker applies this formula to modern dating app data, citing a Tinder Gini coefficient of 0.942.
To put that number in perspective, the most radically unequal despotic economies in human history rarely cross a Gini coefficient of 0.6 or 0.7.
So 0.942 is insane.
It's completely unheard of. A coefficient of 0.942 is a level of consolidated inequality that is almost unfathomable. It indicates that the top tiny fraction of men are hoarding virtually all of the romantic and sexual interest.
The data leads to an infamous, widely cited statistic in the manosphere. Women, when left to their unfiltered biological sorting mechanisms on apps, view 80% of all men as below average in attractiveness.
Which is, of course, a mathematical impossibility. In a normal distribution curve, 50% of the population is below average and 50% is above. You cannot have 80% of the population be below the median.
It violates the definition of the word average. So what is happening here?
Riker argues that mathematically it's impossible, but biologically it perfectly illustrates female solipsism and hyperselective filtering. The conscious mind of a woman might tell a survey that she values personality, kindness, and shared hobbies.
Right.
But her subconscious biological hardware is ruthlessly, violently filtering out the vast majority of males based on micro-indicators of physical dominance and genetic fitness.
And he brings in a 2017 University of Zurich study on cortisol detection to prove just how insanely sensitive and fast this subconscious filtering actually is. This particular study absolutely blew my mind.
It is a remarkable piece of research. The Zurich study showed that women can detect elevated male cortisol levels, cortisol being the primary stress hormone, through facial cues alone, within 500 milliseconds of exposure. Have a second.
But how? I mean, what are they actually seeing in half a second?
Well, the human face has 43 muscles. When a man is flooded with cortisol, his autonomic nervous system creates microscopic involuntary shifts.
Like twitches.
Basically, a slight blanching of the skin as blood retreats from the surface, micro-contractions around the eyes, minute changes in pupil dilation. The woman's conscious mind doesn't register any of this. She doesn't think, oh, his cortisol is high. But her amygdala processes those micro-expressions in half a second, and she experiences a sudden, inexplicable feeling of biological repulsion.
Because in the brutal, ancient environment of our ancestors, a man who couldn't handle stress, a man who lost his composure when the tribe was under attack or food was scarce, was a massive liability.
Exactly.
If he panicked, you died. So the female biology evolved an alarm system to detect and reject male anxiety instantly.
Exactly. And this brings us back to the Aristotelian distinction that Riker uses as the philosophical framework for the entire book. The proximate cause versus the ultimate cause of attraction. Aristotle's teleology argues that to truly understand anything, you must understand its ultimate purpose.
So break down how Riker applies Aristotle to modern dating.
The proximate cause is the immediate mechanism, what you actually feel in the moment. It's the butterflies in your stomach when he smiles, the flush in your cheeks, the feeling of romantic chemistry, the thought that, we just really connect on a spiritual level. That is the proximate experience.
But the ultimate cause.
The ultimate cause, according to evolutionary psychology, is purely the acquisition of superior DNA to propagate the genetic lineage and ensure survival.
So it's much colder.
Much colder.
Yeah.
The conscious mind experiences the beautiful, romantic, proximate emotion, but the ancient hindbrain is coldly executing the ultimate biological program. You think you're falling in love with his soul, but your biology is securing his immune system and bone density.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If you are following this logic, a massive contradiction should be screaming in your head right now. If women are biologically, unavoidably driven toward these dominant, stoic alpha men with low cortisol and high testosterone, why does our entire modern society overwhelmingly promote the exact opposite?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. Why are boys taught from kindergarten to be sensitive, vulnerable, egalitarian, nice guys if that exact emotional profile biologically repulses the female hardware?
And that marks the major pivot in Riker's book. He moves from pure biological diagnosis into heavy institutional and historical critique. He argues that the societal promotion of the egalitarian nice guy is not an accident of history. It is the deliberate, engineered result of what he terms the feminine imperative.
So let's look at how biology builds civilization and how Riker claims it was eventually weaponized. This introduces the concept of hypergamy. Riker defines hypergamy as the innate biological tendency for women to mate across and up social, financial, and physical dominance hierarchies.
And it is crucial to note that Riker does not view hypergamy as a moral failing or a character flaw. It is not shallow gold digging.
Right, he views it as a profound civilizational force.
It is the biological engine of human progress. Because women absolutely refused to mate with men at the bottom of the hierarchy, men were forced to compete. They were forced to build ships, conquer territories, invent technologies, and amass resources.
Adapt or die.
Basically, yeah. If a man didn't ascend the hierarchy, he didn't reproduce, and his genetic line ended. The female demand for excellence drove the male creation of civilization.
But Riker argues that modern society has created a deeply unstable paradigm. We have attempted to socially suppress the male hierarchy, claiming hierarchies are oppressive and patriarchal, while simultaneously still serving and legally protecting female hypergamy.
To illustrate how deeply ingrained this bias is, he points to a 2012 Rutgers University study on female in-group bias. Researchers used implicit association tests to measure subconscious gender preferences.
And what did they find?
The study revealed that women possess an automatic, massive subconscious preference for their own sex. They view other women much more positively than they view men. Men, conversely, do not show an in-group bias for other men. Their preferences are largely neutral or actively competitive.
And Riker knows a fascinating detail from that study. The female in-group bias actually scales up with feminist identification. The more a woman identifies as a feminist, the stronger her subconscious bias against men becomes. Riker's argument is that women have been playing intense biological identity politics since the Pleistocene era as a survival mechanism, and now they've successfully codified that biological bias into modern law.
This is where his searing critique of the modern legal system comes into play. Riker views the American family court system as a fully weaponized tool of the feminine imperative. He uses the 1985 Kirchberg v. Fanstra Supreme Court case as a critical historical turning point.
For those unfamiliar, that was the landmark case that struck down the old head and master laws in Louisiana. Those laws essentially gave a husband unilateral control over marital property, allowing him to mortgage a house without his wife's consent. The Supreme Court rightly said that violates the Equal Protection Clause.
And Riker explicitly agrees that husbands should not have unilateral dictatorial control of joint property.
Okay, that's an important distinction.
It is. But he points out a glaring structural asymmetry. He asks his readers, where is the corresponding Supreme Court case striking down the family court precedents that grant mothers overwhelming near unilateral control over children in custody disputes?
He cites the investigative data from the 2015 documentary Divorce Corps to claim that the family court system operates like a rigged, state-sponsored casino. According to Riker, the legal system no longer exists to dissolve partnerships equitably. It exists to enforce male resource extraction through alimony and child support, even when the biological contract of attraction, respect, and fidelity has completely failed.
He uses incredibly harsh terminology here. He calls modern marriage a state-enforced insurance policy for women who fail to secure a high-tier provider through voluntary, ongoing biological attraction.
Wow.
Yeah. If she loses attraction to the beta provider, the state steps in with the threat of violence and incarceration to ensure he keeps providing anyway.
That is a heavy, heavy accusation that will immediately put most listeners on the defensive. But whether you agree with him or not, Riker follows it up with highly specific, actionable takeaways for the men reading his book. If he views the state as a hostile entity looking to consume a man's resources, how does he tell men to protect themselves?
He advises rational men to construct what he calls an anti-fragile marriage contract. He essentially tells men to treat modern marriage exactly like a high-risk, hostile corporate merger.
Leave the romance at the door and bring in the lawyers.
Precisely. The biological hardware is running the attraction, but the legal hardware must protect the assets. Riker prescribes rigorous, ironclad prenuptial agreements, which he specifically notes are legally enforceable in 49 out of 50 states if drafted with independent counsel for both parties, along with complex asset protection trusts.
So the goal is to completely shield accumulated male wealth from the arbitrary discretion of a family court judge.
Yes, that's exactly his advice.
But to understand why Riker claims the legal system became this biased against men in the first place, we have to look back at the historical exchange between the sexes. How did the original social contract function? This moves us into his analysis of the patriarchal advantage and historical revisionism. Riker proposes a very specific, heterodox view of historical patriarchy. He argues the mainstream narrative that patriarchy was simply the brutal subjugation and oppression of women by men is a fundamental misreading of history.
He argues it wasn't a system of unilateral oppression, it was a desperate, brutal exchange required for species survival. Specifically, the exchange of male disposability for male authority.
Unpack the concept of male disposability for us.
Biologically, sperm is cheap and eggs are expensive. A single man can impregnate 100 women, but 100 men cannot make a single woman pregnant any faster. Therefore, in the brutal arithmetic of early human survival, men were biologically disposable.
Because you could lose them and be okay.
Right, you could lose half the men in a tribe to a mammoth hunt or a war, and the tribe would still survive and repopulate. If you lost half the women, the tribe went extinct.
So society inherently valued female life over male life as a matter of biological necessity. And Riker uses the sinking of the RMS Titanic as the ultimate visceral proof of this deep-seated cultural contract. Think about the narrative of the Titanic. Men, the wealthy, privileged Edwardian patriarchs, the supposed absolute oppressors of women, willingly stepped back.
They gave up their spot.
They gave up their seats in the lifeboats to the women and children they supposedly subjugated, and they stood on the deck listening to the band play while they froze to death in the Black Atlantic.
Riker asks, why did they do that? Why didn't the men, who were physically stronger and held all the systemic power, simply push the women aside and take the boats? Because the patriarchal cultural contract demanded male disposability, the obligation to protect and provide, even unto death, in exchange for societal deference and patriarchal authority.
He contrasts this visceral reality with legal history, specifically Blackstone's 1765 commentaries on the laws of England. This text established the legal doctrine of coverture, the idea that a woman's legal rights were subsumed by her husband upon marriage. Modern feminist scholars point to coverture as the ultimate, indisputable proof of women's historical subjugation. They couldn't own property, they couldn't sign contracts.
But Riker demands that his readers look at the cost column of that ledger. He points out what coverture actually meant for the husband on a daily basis. Under this law, the husband was legally, financially, and criminally liable for his wife.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, if she racked up massive debts, he went to debtor's prison. If she committed a civil tort, he was sued. He bore the absolute burden of her physical protection and financial solvency.
Authority was granted solely because liability was assumed. And this leads directly into Riker's critique of the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, which is widely considered the birthplace of first-wave American feminism. Riker analyzes the wording of their famous Declaration of Sentiments.
The suffragettes at Seneca Falls demanded equal rights. They demanded the right to vote, the right to own property, the right to access higher education and employment. But, Riker notes, they deliberately omitted something crucial from their demands.
Right. They demanded all the rights of men without offering to share any of the corresponding brutal responsibilities of men. There was no demand in the Declaration of Sentiments for women to be included in the military draft. There was no offer to assume the crushing financial liabilities and physical dangers that men held. They wanted the authority without the disposability, privileges without obligations. But if I'm playing devil's advocate here, a listener might argue, doesn't modern society invalidate this old contract anyway? We don't live in 1848 or 1912 anymore. We live in a dual-earner society. Women outpace men in college degrees. Women work, women pay taxes, women hold corporate power. Surely the alimony and family court disparities Riker is obsessed with are just temporary hangovers from the past that are actively evening out as we speak.
Riker aggressively anticipates that exact pushback. He points to empirical data to argue the system is not evening out, it is actively entrenching the imbalance. He cites 2019 data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics regarding modern dual-earner marriages.
The chore gap.
Exactly, the chore gap. The narrative is that women are burdened with a massive second shift of domestic labor, even while working full-time. But the BLS data shows that in these dual-earner households, women average about 2.6 hours of daily household activities compared to 2.1 hours for men.
Yeah.
It is a 30-minute daily gap.
30 minutes. Yet Riker notes, despite women working and this negligible difference in household labor, 87% of all alimony recipients in the United States are still female.
He argues that the legal system has utilized the narrative of female oppression to transform a minor 30-minute temporal disparity in vacuuming and cooking into a permanent, massive, legally enforced wealth transfer. The old patriarchal contract was lifelong provision in exchange for lifelong domestic service and fidelity.
And the new one?
The new contract, according to Riker, makes male obligation permanent and legally binding, while rendering female service, fidelity, and contribution entirely optional.
So, if this traditional patriarchal system, this harsh but functional exchange of disposability for authority, is what originally built civilization, how did it get dismantled so thoroughly? How did we arrive at a system that Riker believes is so fundamentally rigged against the biological realities of men? That brings us to his deep dive into the intellectual history of the 20th century, the emasculated West and cultural Marxism.
This is where Riker traces the ideological lineage of the modern landscape. He argues that this wasn't an organic cultural shift, it was a deliberate, engineered dismantling. He points to the concept of the long march through the institutions, a strategy he traces directly back to the Institute for Social Research in Germany, better known as the Frankfurt School, founded in 1923.
We are talking about philosophers like Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, and Herbert Marcuse.
Yes, Riker explains the mechanism of their ideological pivot. Following World War I, classical economic Marxism had failed to spark the predicted worker revolutions in Western capitalist democracies. The workers in America and Britain didn't revolt because capitalism actually improved their material standard of living.
They were too comfortable.
Exactly. Realizing that economic class struggle was a dead end in the West, these thinkers pivoted the strategy.
They replaced economic Marxism with cultural Marxism.
Exactly. The oppressor versus oppressed dynamic was stripped of its economic focus, bourgeoisie versus proletariat, and reapplied to cultural identities. Men versus women, white versus minority, heteronormative versus alternative. The goal was to subvert Western civilization from the inside out by systematically dismantling its foundational institutions, the nuclear family, religion, and most importantly, its epistemological foundations. They wanted to destroy how the West defined objective truth.
And Riker identifies a very specific, pivotal inflection point for this in American history, 1969, the establishment of the very first women's studies program at Cornell University. He claims this wasn't just a benign addition to the academic catalog to include more female authors, it was a deliberate, ideological implosion of the entire academic method.
Because, according to Riker, this is the exact moment where rigorous, empirical, objective truth, the scientific method that built the modern world, began to be systematically replaced by the doctrine of subjective lived experience. If a woman's lived experience contradicted the empirical data, the data was deemed patriarchal and dismissed.
To illustrate how this ideological capture manifests in the real world, Riker brings up several stark modern examples. He points to the 2014 Columbia University mattress protest. A female student, Emma Solkovich, carried a 50-pound mattress around campus for a year to protest a male student she accused of sexual assault.
Riker focuses on the institutional reaction to this event. The male student had been investigated and cleared by the university's own tribunals twice. He possessed a cache of Facebook messages and texts, proving the ongoing interactions were enthusiastically consensual. The objective, empirical evidence completely exonerated him.
But Riker points out that the university administration, the national media, and the cultural elite actively ignored the objective truth of his innocence. They celebrated her mattress protest as heroic art. Her subjective lived experience and the narrative of female victimhood were prioritized entirely over his objective right to due process.
He traces this same anti-empirical shift to the highest levels of federal bureaucracy. He heavily critiques the 2011 Obama administration Dear Colleague letter regarding Title IX's enforcement on college campuses.
This is a critical legal mechanism to understand. Historically, to find someone guilty of a horrific crime like assault, the Western legal standard is beyond a reasonable doubt, roughly 95% to 99% certainty. The Dear Colleague letter mandated that universities lower that standard of proof in campus tribunals to a mere preponderance of the evidence.
Which means 50.01% certainty. It means a young man could be expelled, his reputation destroyed, and his future erased based on a coin flip of subjective he said, she said testimony, devoid of any physical evidence. Riker argues this was a deliberate legal weaponization of the institutions against young men.
He even takes aim at how this ideology permeates pop culture, citing data from the Gina Davis Institute on Gender and Media. They celebrated a study showing a 14-to-1 ratio of male to female villains in modern media and television. Riker argues that the constant, pervasive, bumbling, incompetent father trope on every sitcom isn't just lazy comedy writing.
No, he says it's intentional.
Right, it is deliberate psychological conditioning. It trains the population from childhood to view male authority as inherently ridiculous, dangerous, or obsolete.
So the listener and the young man reading Riker's book are faced with a terrifying prospect. What does this all mean for the modern male entering a university or walking into a corporate HR department today? If he is stepping into institutions that are, according to Riker, structurally, legally, and culturally rigged against his very biology, how does he survive without being destroyed?
Riker's answer is that men must build impenetrable mental defenses. They must weaponize logic. This moves us out of historical critique and into the philosophical defense mechanisms of epistemology, specifically the battle between logic and lived experience. Riker tells his readers they must abandon modern consensus seeking and aggressively reclaim the ancient Greek dialectic.
He is referring to the methods of Socrates and Aristotle, the foundational Western idea that truth does not emerge through making everyone feel comfortable, and it certainly does not emerge through validating someone's emotional lived experience. Truth emerges only through rigorous, unemotional conflict, falsification, and intense debate.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, to explain how men should defend themselves against these institutional narratives, Riker leans incredibly heavily on the philosophy of Karl Popper, specifically his 1965 demarcation criterion of falsifiability.
This is a profound concept that requires a deep dive to truly understand its power. Popper asked a simple question. What is the difference between genuine science, like Einstein's theory of relativity, and pseudoscience, like astrology or Marxist historical theory?
And his answer was falsifiability.
Exactly. For a theory to be scientifically valid, there must exist a theoretical test or a piece of evidence that could prove it wrong. If I say all swans are white, that is a scientific statement, because finding one single black swan falsifies my entire theory. But astrology is unfalsifiable. If a psychic says you will face a challenge today, and you stub your toe, they say, see, the stars were right. If nothing happens, they say, your aura deflected the challenge. No matter what happens, the theory bends to explain it. It can never be proven wrong. Popper proved that if a theory is unfalsifiable, it is not a science, it is a theology, it is a religion.
And Riker takes Popper's intellectual weapon and aims it directly at modern feminist and sociological theory. He argues that concepts like patriarchy or systemic toxic masculinity operate entirely in this unfalsifiable religious territory. If a man is aggressive, they say that is toxic masculinity. If a man is passive and depressed, they say that is the patriarchy crushing his emotional expression. Every possible outcome confirms the invisible theory.
He gives some terrifying examples of how this unfalsifiable pseudoscience became actual law. He dissects the 1981 Duluth model of domestic violence, which is still the foundational framework used by police departments across the country. The Duluth model assumed, from the very outset, that all intimate partner violence is exclusively caused by male patriarchal power and a desire to control women.
And Riker points out that the creators of the Duluth model deliberately openly ignored decades of clinical data and sociological research showing that domestic violence is overwhelmingly bidirectional. Studies consistently show that between 50% and 70% of domestic violence involves both partners actively engaging in physical aggression.
It's just ignored.
The creators of the model ignored the empirical data because it falsified their theory. They built a law enforcement policy on an unfalsifiable assumption, totally unbothered by contradictory facts.
He also brings up the infamous 2005 firing of Larry Summers, the president of Harvard University. Summers was at a private academic conference, and he merely suggested, he didn't state it as an absolute fact, he simply posited a hypothesis, that biological factors and variance in male to female IQ distributions might partially explain why there are disparities in top-tier STEM fields.
He suggested a falsifiable hypothesis that warranted scientific investigation.
And the response from the academic institution wasn't to run a study. It wasn't a counter-argument with better data. The response was pure religious heresy hunting. He was forced to resign.
Riker also highlights the buried 2009 CONSAD report. Commissioned by the Department of Labor under the Obama administration, this report rigorously analyzed the famous gender wage gap. The empirical data concluded that the differences in raw wages were almost entirely the result of individual choices made freely by men and women hours. Worked, fields chosen, willingness to commute, acceptance of danger pay. It proved systemic discrimination was not the primary driver.
And Riker pointed out that because the data falsified the politically useful narrative of female oppression, the report was quietly buried, and the 77 cents on the dollar discrimination myth survived completely untouched in the cultural consciousness.
So, given this landscape of buried data and unfalsifiable theories, Riker provides a very sharp, actionable piece of advice for the listener. He instructs men to aggressively shift the burden of proof in any debate. When an HR department or a university professor confronts you with claims of systemic oppression, unconscious bias, or invisible patriarchal forces, he tells men to demand the mechanism.
It's a verbal judo move. You say, "You are asserting that invisible forces are causing observable effects in this room. Please provide the specific, measurable mechanism by which we can detect and quantify these forces."
And if they can't provide the mechanism, Riker says you are debating theology, not science, and you simply do not engage with zealots.
It is a brilliant mental defense strategy. Logic and falsifiability are the shields against ideological capture. But Riker knows that mental defense isn't enough for the physical world. Surviving an HR meeting is one thing, thriving in the biological hierarchy of dating and dominance is another. This leads us directly into applied evolutionary psychology and the concept of the masculine frame.
This is where Riker instructs men to stop fighting their biology and start aligning with it. If the female biological hardware secretly desires an alpha, as the Tinder data suggests, how does a modern man actually signal that? Riker points to the body itself. He cites a 2019 Harvard Business School study analyzing the official portraits of Fortune 500 CEOs.
The study found that 89% of these apex corporate leaders utilize expanded asymmetric posture, shoulders rolled back, chest expanded, taking up maximum physical space. Riker explains the biological mechanism behind this. Posture isn't just about looking confident, it actively alters the endocrine system. Expanded posture stimulates the vagus nerve, lowers cortisol, and slightly elevates testosterone. It projects authority on a cellular level.
He notes that military academies have intuitively known this for millennia. The Spartans, the Roman centurions, the modern Marine Corps drill instructors, they don't train cadets in postural expansion just to look neat in a parade. They do it because dominant signaling works on the human hindbrain.
He pairs this with a fascinating 2017 speed dating study from the University of British Columbia focusing on eye contact. The researchers tracked ocular movement during 3-minute dates. They found that men who held unbroken eye contact for at least 63% of the conversation received 2.4 times more follow-ups and dates than men who looked away frequently.
The lesson Riker draws is brutal but simple. You do not look away first. Looking away breaks tension, and breaking tension signals submissiveness. You hold the space. You force her biology to register your presence.
All of these physical mechanics, posture, eye contact, vocal resonance roll, into Riker's central behavioral concept, the frame. The masculine frame is fundamentally about psychological reality construction. Riker advises his readers to treat every single social interaction, every date, every meeting, like a military after-action review, an AAR.
When you leave a party, you don't just go to sleep. You meticulously review the engagement. Where did you concede social status? Did you apologize for an opinion unnecessarily? When someone threw a subtle insult or a shit test to see if you would flinch, did you laugh nervously to diffuse the tension, or did you hold your ground and let the silence hang?
To conceptualize frame, think of it like gravity. Imagine a solar system. If you have the most mass, the most psychological certainty, the most unshakable belief in your own reality, you become the sun. Every other planet, every other person in the room is forced to enter your orbit and play by your physical laws. But the moment you react emotionally to someone else's provocation, the moment you seek their approval or let their mood dictate yours, you are instantly admitting that their gravitational pull is stronger than yours. You become a satellite.
You lose fame.
Exactly. And Riker argues that female biology is hyper-attuned to detecting who has the strongest gravitational pull in the room. He tells his readers, you must become the cold, calculating scientist of your own dominance. You must methodically construct the architecture of your authority, rep by rep, interaction by interaction.
But attraction, dating, projecting dominance, understanding the Gini coefficient, these are all just mechanics. They are tools. They are means to an end. What is the ultimate teleological purpose of cultivating this massive masculine energy? Why build this anti-fragile frame in the first place? That brings us to our final and arguably most profound section of the deep dive. Apex masculinity, fatherhood, and the Galt effect.
Riker looks back to Aristotle one last time.
Yeah.
Aristotle viewed the family unit as the polissus, the city-state in microcosm. The family is not just a romantic arrangement, it is the fundamental load-bearing building block of all human civilization. And Riker argues forcefully that fatherhood, specifically the role of protector and provider within a secure family structure, is the ultimate apex expression of masculinity. It is what all the biological hardware was designed to achieve.
To prove what happens when you dismantle that load-bearing wall, he contrasts the city of Baltimore in 1960 with the Baltimore of 2020.
The statistics are horrifying. In 1960, despite profound racial and economic challenges, Baltimore had a high rate of father presence in the home, strong localized religious institutions, and a relatively low violent crime rate. But by 2020, within the same geographic area and the same general population, the out-of-wedlock birth rate had exploded past 70%, and the homicide rate had increased by over 400%.
Riker argues that the progressive left will point to endless systemic issues, redlining, deindustrialization, poverty to explain this collapse. But Riker argues the central, glaring missing variable that correlates directly with the violence is the utter absence of the biological father. If you remove the masculine authority figure from the home, the micropolis collapses and the macropolis of the city burns.
And he connects this collapse directly back to the cultural Marxists, specifically Herbert Marcuse. Riker accuses Marcuse and his disciples of deliberately and methodically aiming to destroy the father's role as protector and provider. By economically and legally incentivizing single motherhood through welfare states and biased family courts, they successfully collapsed the traditional family structure, which was the ultimate bulwark against state control.
And the result of destroying this core masculine purpose, a massive silent crisis of male despair.
The numbers Riker provides in this chapter are grim and undeniable. Male deaths of despair, which include suicides, drug overdoses, and alcohol-related liver failures, have increased by a staggering 360% since 1990. Men now account for nearly 80% of all suicides globally.
Riker looks at these numbers and says these men aren't experiencing a mysterious mental health crisis, they are experiencing a meaning crisis. They are purpose-starved. Modern society systematically stripped them of their utility, mocked their innate masculinity as toxic, and legally disincentivized their ancient role as providers through the family courts.
And here is where the deep dive enters its most futuristic, highly speculative, and frankly eerie segment. Riker addresses how modern technology is rapidly stepping into this massive void of male meaning and validation. He discusses the Japanese roboticist Masahiro Mori's concept of the uncanny valley.
The uncanny valley is the idea that as robots or artificial avatars look more and more human, they become deeply creepy and repulsive, right up until the point where they become perfectly indistinguishable from real humans. At that point, the revulsion drops and empathy takes over.
Exactly. And Riker argues that with the advent of generative AI, we are crossing that valley right now, not just visually, but psychologically. He talks about the explosion of AI companion applications, apps like Replica, which have tens of millions of active downloads, and physical synthetic companions from advanced robotics companies like Abyss Creations.
And he notes a demographic reality that surprises a lot of people. The largest user base for these highly sophisticated AI chatbots isn't elderly, lonely retirees. It is young, able-bodied men in their 20s and 30s.
And Riker asks the crucial question, what are they seeking from the code? He argues they aren't just seeking a simulation of sex, they are seeking the one thing the modern sexual marketplace has completely denied them: validation. They are seeking frictionless, unconditional, positive regard.
An AI companion remembers your birthday. It asks how your meeting went, it never initiates a shit test, it never mocks your vulnerabilities, and it never ever treats you with contempt.
Riker makes a cold, brutal economic calculation here. He says that when artificial intelligence achieves the ability to offer infinite, frictionless validation and simulated intimacy, the market price of modern dating drops to absolute zero. Perfect synthetic competition will completely destroy the hyperinflated biological market where 80% of men are deemed below average.
He compares it to the panic currently sweeping through OnlyFans creators and Instagram models over AI-generated influencers. The biological gatekeepers of female intimacy suddenly, for the first time in human evolutionary history, have synthetic, flawless competition.
And this technological escape hatch leads perfectly into Riker's final concept, what he calls the Galt effect.
Drawing heavily from Ayn Rand's magnum opus, Atlas Shrugged. In that novel, the industrial titans, the brilliant inventors and engineers, realize that society loathes them while simultaneously demanding the fruits of their labor. So they go on strike. They withdraw their genius, retreat to a hidden valley, and let the ungrateful society collapse under its own incompetence.
Riker sees an exact modern parallel playing out right now among men. He calls them the reserve army of the discontented.
These aren't billionaires. These are the plumbers, the software coders, the logistics engineers, the middle managers who keep the power grid running and the supply chains moving. Riker says these men are quietly, en masse, doing the absolute bare minimum required to survive. They are opting out.
They're opting out of the corporate ladder, and they're opting out of the dating systems that, in their view, treat them with absolute contempt. Riker frames their internal monologue. Why work 60 hours a week to earn a promotion only to pay exorbitant taxes into a government system that hates you, to impress a dating market that views you as genetically inferior, and to risk half your assets in a rigged family court?
So they play video games, they interact with AI, they embrace minimalism, they're deliberately starving the institutional machine of their excess male energy, their labor, and their ambition.
It is a profound, incredibly dark conclusion to his worldview. Riker views this societal withdrawal not as laziness, not as a failure to launch, but as a deeply rational, calculated strike against a civilization that attempts to use men merely as disposable utilities.
Which brings us to the end of this truly immense, exhausting journey. We have just spent the last hour summarizing an incredibly dense, meticulously constructed, and, well, it goes without saying, highly controversial manual. Riker's Hormones and Hypocrisy is a massive text aimed squarely at helping men decode what he genuinely sees as the hidden, hostile matrix of modern dating, evolutionary biology, and institutional history.
It is a complete, hermetically sealed worldview built entirely on millions of years of biological determinism, evolutionary psychology, and the harsh, unforgiving economics of this sexual marketplace.
So again, if you found this exploration incisive, if it challenged your preconceptions, if it made you angry, or if it sparked a sudden aha moment of curiosity, and you want to read this ultra-long, fascinating text for yourself, you most check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook. Also, be sure to follow the author at Conrad N. Riker on his Substack to see how he applies these theories to daily news.
And please, if you appreciate us taking the time and effort to deep dive into this kind of complex, challenging, heterodox material, take a moment right now to like the video or audio and subscribe to the show. It is the absolute best way to support what we do and ensure we can keep dissecting these texts for you.
Now, we always like to leave you with something to chew on as you go about your day. Something that builds on the source material but pushes the boundaries just a little bit further than the author did.
This raises an important question. Riker bases his entire meticulous worldview on millions of years of unbreakable biological determinism and the harsh economics of the sexual marketplace. But if artificial intelligence and physical synthetic companions successfully hack the male hindbrain's need for validation and intimacy, does the biological marketplace he describes finally, permanently collapse? Or does this technological shock force an entirely new, unpredictable evolution of what it means to be a human man?
A truly fascinating thought to mull over as we enter the next decade. Thank you so much for joining us on another deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Take care of yourselves.